and welcome to the Children's Policy Centre webinar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians on the land on which I live, work and play, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, whose knowledge has shaped and continues to shape and evolve our understanding of the land and the seas and ways of being. I'm Angie Bexley, Deputy Director of the Children's Policy Centre based here at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. This is the fourth in our series of webinars at the Children's Policy Centre, marking 30 years since Australia ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, known as the CRC. You can see the recordings of the first three webinars on our website, and for our final seminar next week, which will be on Tuesday at 5 p.m, we'll be talking with members of the Youth Advisory Council. Participation has been a strong thread throughout this webinar series, and Article 12 is considered the cornerstone of the CRC in that it provides a right in and of itself, while also facilitating and supporting the realisation of all rights articulated in the Convention. Article 12 establishes the right of every child to freely express her or his views in all matters affecting him or her, and the subsequent right for those views to be given due weight according to the child's age and maturity. We are very fortunate today to have with us here Dr. Holly Doel-Mackaway, who is going to share with us her research on how Article 12 plays out in the context of Australia. Holly is a senior lecturer with the Macquarie Law School, and her forthcoming book published by Routledge will be out next year and is titled Indigenous Children's Participation in Law and Policy Development. Holly's current project, together with Amy Williamson, who is based at the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Centre here at the ANU, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, or IATSIS, and the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, is called the Participation of Young Aboriginal Victorians in the First Peoples Treaty Assembly Elections. This project seeks to understand the unique experiences of young Aboriginal Victorians in the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria elections in 2019, and is part of a larger project that explores how young Indigenous people are engaging, participating and designing pathways to emerge into governance and policy-making spaces in their communities, regions, states and territories. The title of Holly's talk today is Ask Us, This is Our Country, Aboriginal Children and Young People's Participation in Public Decision Making. We will have time for questions at the end, so please pop your questions in the chat box, or the chat function, and we'll address those at the end. Over to you, Holly.
Thanks so much, Angie, for your kind introduction, and hello everyone. It's my pleasure to be presenting this webinar today, and I thank Sharon so much for inviting me to do so. Before I speak today, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work and play on Darug land belonging to the Wadamadigal people. And the field research I'll be talking about today was conducted on the lands of the Aboriginal peoples of the Central Australian Desert. Now, these lands have never been ceded and remain sovereign Aboriginal lands. I'm going to share my screen with you now, and I have prepared some slides to facilitate this presentation. So I will just share that now, and I hope you can see those. Considering that we're marking 30 years since Australia ratified the CRC, I recognise that Aboriginal people and Aboriginal elders have been nurturing and teaching children on these lands since the beginning. And from this comes a vast body of knowledge about child rearing, about engaging young people in decision making, including in engaging young Aboriginal people in indigenous lawmaking. Now, this knowledge and these practices remain unrecognised within colonial systems. As a preface to this talk, it is important that I acknowledge, particularly given my background as a social worker and as a lawyer, that Australian legal systems, including the juvenile justice and child protection systems, have and continue to be responsible for gross violations of Aboriginal children and young people's rights. The removal of Aboriginal children from country and from family through targeted discriminatory laws is occurring at higher rates today than ever before. Racially targeted laws, such as the laws surrounding the Northern Territory intervention, which I'm going to be talking about today, create an enabling environment for structural discrimination, which has in turn been shown by scholars such as Professor Thalia Anthony to in fact facilitate Aboriginal child removal. But there are many opportunities to right these wrongs. And I aim to convey in this webinar today how listening to and responding to and taking notice of young Aboriginal people's perspectives is a much needed way to drive change and to address structural discrimination and inequality. Hannah McGlade, Noongar woman, academic and lawyer, characterises Aboriginal young people's human rights as the greatest challenge facing Australia today. She advocates that there is no greater social, political, cultural or legal imperative than for Aboriginal children's rights to be realised in Australia. The purpose of my webinar today is to communicate one key thing, that a key way to address this challenge, the challenge of fulfilling and respecting Indigenous children's rights, is to listen and take notice of their perspectives. But not only to listen and take notice, but to embed these perspectives into Indigenous related law and policy. So in marking Australia's ratification of the CRC, I aim to show the enormous value of this instrument, that together with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN DRIP, provides a roadmap for how governments can engage Aboriginal children and young people in law and policy development. To do this, to demonstrate this, I'm going to share with you some insights that I gathered during field research that I undertook with a group of Aboriginal children and young people in the Northern Territory. The young people that I'll be reflecting their ideas were aged between 10 and 17 years old, and their ideas led to the development of a model for Indigenous young people's participation in law and policy development that I will share with you towards the end of this presentation. A good starting point for this talk is to think about the role of young people on the world stage and how they are influencing world politics. The examples I want to share with you demonstrate that young people, especially young Indigenous people, are ready, they are willing, and they are able to engage in law and policy making processes. As you know, there are many examples of young people working to influence social change across the world. Canadian Indigenous water activist Autumn Peltier, 15, who in September 2019 addressed hundreds at the UN headquarters. She urged the global community to respect the sacredness and importance of clean water. Again, last year, Duan Hussain, the young star of the documentary that I'm sure many people have already seen, In My Blood It Runs. If you haven't, I highly recommend you watch that exceptional documentary. He spoke at the UN Human Rights Council and he shared his experiences with the youth justice system. And he called for building support for Aboriginal-led education models. He urged the Australian government to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14 years of age. And he urged the Australian governments to stop putting 10-year-olds in jail. He said, "I came here to speak to you because the Australian government is not listening. Adults never listen to kids like me, but we have important things to say, things I want to see changed. I want my school to be run by Aboriginal people. I want adults to stop putting 10-year-olds in jail. I want to be able to learn strong culture and language. It's about our dreams, our hopes, and our rights." Now, another young person who I'm sure you've heard a lot from, who's received a lot of media coverage for her climate activism, is Greta Thunberg. And she spoke last year at the UN Climate Action Summit. So I share these examples because young people are demanding change, but Australian governments and many others internationally are yet to respond and listen to these demands. This is shown in Melinda's reflection on your screen. This reflection highlights a gap in the Australian children's rights landscape for Aboriginal children and young people. Aboriginal children and young people are rarely listened to, rarely invited to participate in public decision-making processes. And this is because Australia has a long track record of not listening to children, particularly not listening to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander children. This is a quote from 9 years ago from the Child Rights Task Force NGO report that called on Australia to learn to listen to Aboriginal children. Yet this is still not happening. I want to communicate today that seeking, listening to and responding to the views of Aboriginal children and young people opens new possibilities to build a future based on respect for Indigenous peoples in Australia in accordance with international law, and that the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN DRIP provide a very useful and appropriate legal foundation to do this. So I want to convey 2 key messages in this webinar. Firstly, that lawmaking about Aboriginal children without Aboriginal children must stop. Lawmaking such as the laws surrounding the intervention in the Northern Territory and much of the child protection and juvenile justice legislation across all jurisdictions in Australia must stop. This kind of lawmaking is contrary to international children's rights law standards, and it's contrary to Australia's obligations under human rights law. The second message I want to convey is that Aboriginal children and young people are ready, they are willing, and they are able to contribute to lawmaking processes. And if they are afforded the opportunity, the incorporation of their views in laws and in policy could radically transform legal systems and radically transform child justice in Australia. Not a lot, sadly, has changed since the task force's report in 2011. The Naga Digi report, meaning Hear Me, Hear Us, was released by the Macquarie Youth Council in August 2018. Young people's stories shared in that report detail serious breaches of Aboriginal people's human rights and a failure of the Victorian government and affiliated agencies to uphold these rights. The stories reveal chronic structural discrimination and ongoing systemic failures to respect, protect, and fulfill young First Nations people's rights in child protection, in juvenile justice, and in out-of-home care settings. What then is the way forward? The Uluru Statement from the Heart was released in May 2017, and it calls for constitutional amendment to enshrine a First Nations voice and to establish a Makarrata Commission for truth-telling. The Uluru Statement from the Heart moved the public consciousness from a focus on reconciliation to a focus on legally enforceable mechanisms to ensure Indigenous voice in Parliament, and to further open the way for self-determination and truth-telling as a nation. These are the necessary components for any path toward treaty or agreement making. The Australian government has rejected this statement, but many people are working tirelessly to progress this agenda. In the face of much opposition, young Indigenous people are demanding their voices be heard and demanding their rights, as the CRC enables and provides for. In August last year, 2 years after the Uluru Statement was released, a group of Indigenous young people gathered in East Arnhem Land for the Youth Forum at the 21st Annual Gama Gathering. They produced the Imagination Declaration, which has already been mentioned in another seminar run by John Tobin. And they produced the Imagination Declaration and presented it to the Australian Prime Minister and Education Ministers across Australia. And it was read out by one of the delegates at the forum, Sienna Stubbs. The declaration challenges the federal and state governments to engage with Indigenous young people, to imagine together the possibilities for the future. The declaration is an emphatic statement that demands genuine inclusion of Aboriginal young people in public decision-making. Importantly, it rewrites the narrative, focusing on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous leadership, especially emanating from young Indigenous people. It calls out deficit rhetoric that we see and hear so often, such as the closing the gap discourse and other tropes surrounding Indigenous policy frameworks. The Imagination Declaration is consistent with the principles of both the CRC and the UN DRIP, and it is a stark example of young Indigenous people taking the lead and demanding the fulfilment of Indigenous children's human rights. All right, I've got a news flash. I'd like to share another very important advance for children's rights in Australia. The Imagination Declaration is one very important advance in Australia, but so is this. The First Peoples Assembly of Victoria is the elected voice for Aboriginal people and communities in future treaty discussions. Something very important happened last year. For the first time in Australian history, voting rights in a state election were extended to 16 and 17-year-old Aboriginal people. I can't overstate how radical this legal change is. Never before have 16 and 17-year-old people been eligible to vote in a state election in Australia. This should be being shouted from the rooftops and at least published widely in the media. I'm not seeing evidence of that. And I recognise I don't live in Victoria and perhaps I'm missing a lot of media around this, but friends who do live in Victoria say this is not being publicised widely. But this marks a key point in Australian history for the advancement of young Indigenous people's rights and the inclusion of their perspectives in decision-making processes. It is a stunning example of Indigenous leadership that models to the rest of the nation the value and importance of young Indigenous perspectives in law and policy making. My research collaborator, Bayami Williamson from the ANU Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research and I, we're conducting, as Angie mentioned at the beginning, field research via Zoom with young Aboriginal people in Victoria to understand their experiences of voting, or in many cases of not voting, in the elections to form the membership of the Assembly. We're also wanting to understand their aspirations and ambitions for treaty or agreement making. We are hoping that this research will not only mark this very significant point in Australia's child rights history as a huge advance, the extension of franchise to 16 and 17-year-old Aboriginal people in such a significant election, but we're also hoping to demonstrate the value of the inclusion of young people's voices in serious matters of legal development, including in agreement making and treaty. So, as Angie mentioned in the beginning, the legal basis for children's participation is primarily Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are other articles that support children's participation, but this is the main one, which provides that all people under the age of 18 have the right to express their views about matters affecting them and to have these views taken into account when decisions that are going to impact them are made. Now, this provision, Article 12 of the Convention, encompasses the duty to engage Indigenous young people in legislative development about laws that are likely to affect them. This is Laura Lundy, a very well-known child rights scholar. This is her conceptualisation of the 4 dimensions of Article 12, of which expressing a view is only one dimension. This is one of the most cited child rights articles in the world. And Lundy articulates that young people's voices are not enough, that they must be heard in the appropriate space, and these views must be given due weight and must influence the appropriate audience. In addition to Article 12, Article 19 of the UN DRIP provides that states must consult with and obtain free, prior and informed consent before adopting and implementing any legislation that may affect or impact Indigenous peoples. So together, Article 12 and Article 19 of the UN DRIP form the legal basis of the model for Indigenous young people's participation in lawmaking that I'll propose shortly. The key question that drives my research is why and how should Aboriginal children and young people be involved in the development of laws and policies that will affect them? Unfortunately, as we all know, the involvement of Indigenous young people in legal decision-making processes is rare. This demonstrates long-held conceptualizations of children and of childhood, including of Indigenous children as being mini-humans with mini-human rights, who lack the requisite agency to inform, let alone participate in decision-making processes, especially decision-making processes such as lawmaking. To answer this question, I conducted field research in the Northern Territory with a group of Aboriginal young people, and all participants in this field research identified as Aboriginal, not as Torres Strait Islander. And I asked them their views about the Northern Territory intervention. The intervention is an example of a suite of laws that were rushed through federal parliament without consultation with Aboriginal people, and certainly without consultation with young Aboriginal people. And this was determined by the United Nations to be in breach of international law. Very briefly, I'm going to share a little bit about what the intervention is. This is the central case study of the research that I conducted. It refers to the package of legislation surrounding the Northern Territory Emergency Response, which was then later rebranded the Stronger Futures legislation. Most commonly, however, it's referred to as the intervention, both bodies of legislation. In choosing this case study, I wondered what Aboriginal young people thought about these measures, as there are no other documented accounts of children's views in this regard. I wondered about a scenario where international law was observed and Aboriginal children's voices did matter and could influence the development of legislation. Now, that might appear to be a utopian question, but international law demands that and requires that. So it is a valid legal question to ask about what law could look like if young people were involved in the framing and design of such laws. So by way of background, in 2007, the Australian federal government under Prime Minister John Howard set aside the Racial Discrimination Act under a special measures provision and commenced the Northern Territory Emergency Response to purportedly address allegations of child sexual abuse and neglect in Northern Territory Aboriginal communities. The purported catalyst for the intervention, the Little Children Are Sacred report, the cover is pictured on the screen, was an inquiry made by the NT government into the protection of Aboriginal children from sexual abuse. This report outlined child abuse, neglect, and widespread poverty among some Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory. The Australian federal government used this report as the purported basis to introduce the intervention. Many commentators, including Larissa Behrendt and Alistair Nicholson, however, argue that this report was the means by which the measures taken under the intervention could be justified. Notably, the fact that the legislation hardly mentions children also indicates that the legislation was not primarily directed towards so-called protecting children. The intervention made changes to welfare provision, to law enforcement, to land tenure and other measures. And it affected over 53,000 Aboriginal people in 73 prescribed areas in the Territory. It was carried out by 600 Australian Defence Force personnel. You can see that in the middle picture in the slide there. The model chosen by the Commonwealth Government to implement the intervention was based around a law and order military response to a context that was branded and named an emergency. And as such, because of that branding and that naming as an emergency, this gave way to evoking a special measures provision and setting aside of the Racial Discrimination Act, making it legal to racially discriminate. It was not based on a human rights approach to addressing child rights abuses. The photograph in the middle of this slide represents that military style approach adopted. There is, and there was at the time, widespread consensus, including from the UN, that the intervention breached human rights law and was and is inadequate and tokenistic with respect to consultation with Indigenous peoples. Notably, the intervention continues in the Northern Territory today. In my research, I asked young Aboriginal people their views about two key elements of the intervention. And those elements were income quarantining through the basics card and alcohol regulation in prescribed communities. Very quickly, compulsory income management applies to everyone living in a prescribed community in the Territory who are recipients of government welfare payments. The same total amount of welfare money is received. However, 50%, approximately 50% of these welfare payments are quarantined for use on basics, such as food, housing, clothing, bills. And it can't be used, the basics card, to purchase alcohol, cigarettes, for gambling, or to buy pornography. Part of the alcohol regulation measures under the intervention were the erection of large blue and white warning signs that stand very tall, approximately 3 meters. And they are positioned at the entrance to prescribed communities, stating in English, no liquor and no pornography. These signs outline the penalties for the possession, sale and consumption of alcohol and for the possession and sale of certain pornographic materials. I'd like to note that issues to do with pornography, as noted on the signs, were not raised by any young people involved in my research, nor did I ask young people to discuss these issues in line with the ethical consideration and scope of this project. Notably though, it didn't arise in the course of many discussions about the intervention with young people. In brief, children reflected a sophisticated understanding of the legislative provisions surrounding the intervention. And they said that the intervention and the legislative provisions surrounding it affected them. They said that the basics card and the alcohol regulation measures were racist. They represented, in their words, bad racism. They said that the alcohol measures, the warning signs, the large warning signs at the entrance to each of the communities, shamed communities, particularly shamed men in those communities. They spoke about their fathers, their uncles, their brothers, their grandfathers being shamed by the alcohol warning signs and the commentary around that. Now, this demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the legislative provisions to do with the intervention, shows Indigenous young people's capacity to engage in law-related conversations, capacities that so often, given the focus on deficits of children, are not permitted to engage in. Young people are generally not asked about matters to do with law and policy, under the assumption that young people wouldn't be able to participate in such conversations. Thus, their views are dismissed or not even sought from the beginning. So what did young people say about the basics card? Young people said that the basics card helps in some ways. Young people said that it helps with budgeting and access to food and toys and helps with paying bills. They did say, however, that a key card could achieve a similar purpose. They said that the quarantining of money on the basics card was not necessary. Importantly, they said that the basics card stopped dishonest trading, that so often before the basics card or when cash is used, that young people were ripped off in retail outlets and not given the correct amount of change, that the basics card stopped that dishonest trading. But they did note that that also occurred using a regular key card that wasn't associated with quarantining of welfare money. What is very significant about this research is that the young people involved did not know that the basics card was only available and used with people who were in receipt of welfare in the Northern Territory in the prescribed areas. They thought that the basics card was something that was available to all people across Australia who had been in receipt of welfare. When they learnt that during a research process, which is staggering in and of itself, children defined the basics card as bad racism, and that this should be available voluntarily for anybody who wants it, and that targeting Aboriginal people was bad racism. What did young people say about the blue and white warning signs? They said that these signs shame communities. They said they are ineffective. They don't stop people drinking alcohol. Many children said that alcohol wasn't a significant problem in their community where a sign was erected, that their community had been a dry community, so an alcohol-free community for many, many years, but yet this sign was still at the front of their community, a dry community. They said that was offensive and inappropriate. They said that the signs don't help Aboriginal children and young people. James, a pseudonym for a 17-year-old participant, said, no, I don't like them. Tessa said, it makes communities look bad. They don't respect the community. Sean said, they're racist. What were young people's views about participating in lawmaking? This was the other element of this research. So I wanted to ascertain young people's views about the intervention and the two elements of the intervention, but I also wanted to ascertain young people's views about participating in lawmaking. Nathaniel said, ask us, this is our country. Importantly, participants, and that statement is an example of this, participants expressed their desire to be involved in law and policy making about matters that are going to affect their lives. And they articulated three key reasons why this is important and why this is necessary. First, because the involvement of Aboriginal young people in law and policy making is appropriate, given their status as the rightful owners and custodians of the land upon which and through the law operates. Secondly, because Aboriginal young people have a vital role to play in assisting law and policy makers to understand and take into consideration Aboriginal law and culture. They said, without us, how will lawmakers know? There's so few lawmakers who are Aboriginal. Third, because if legislators and policymakers listened to Aboriginal children and young people, they are able to provide valuable insights into how laws could be fashioned to be more culturally sensitive and relevant to Aboriginal people, particularly young people. Now, one of the key themes arising from these conversations concerned the correlation many young people made between their indigeneity and participating in law and policy making. All children said they had never had the opportunity to express their views to government about any laws or any policies that were likely to affect them. And this includes the intervention legislation. One young person expressed the negative consequences of hers and other young people's non-participation in what she called the secret process of lawmaking. She said, governments, they don't ask us, they do it secret. It makes us feel bad about that. They just make up rules on our land. We need to follow their rules. Importantly, this research indicates that Aboriginal children and young people want to be involved, to be listened to, and have their views taken into account when big decisions like laws are going to be made that will affect them. Young people said that in order for governments to engage them in lawmaking processes, governments must understand the importance of Aboriginal culture and traditions, and they must seek appropriate permissions to conduct respectful conversations. The word respect came up in my NVivo common word search, the most out of all words. So that's really important that young people spoke about young people being respected by governments very frequently throughout the research. And to do this, Aboriginal young people said, you've got to seek Aboriginal children's views in a respectful way. You've got to consult with elders, parents, with schools, respectfully. You've got to ensure the space is appropriate. They told me stories about how when the second round of, the new iteration of the intervention legislation was being developed, now known as the Stronger Futures legislation, that adults were invited to provide feedback. And Jenny Macklin went to the Territory and held consultations in well-known large hotels. And numerous children reported that their family members were not able to access those hotels because they were refused entry because of dress code requirements. So children said, come to our communities, don't make us go out to be heard, to be listened to. And I think that that is a vital point, that if governments are going to truly seek Aboriginal young people's views, they must go to them, ask us, come and see us, which is another quote from young people in this research. So this is the model. This is hot off the press. This will be published in my book about this research next year by Routledge. Now, this model isn't just about law and policy making. This is not just for governments. This can apply to any decision-making process where the decision maker wants to engage young people in the process. So it could apply to NGOs, to schools, and even within families and communities. The model consists of 5 key elements. They're not steps though. There is some sequence to the model that, for example, in order to understand element 2 and address ethical issues, element 1, the adoption of a child rights-based approach, must have occurred first. Similarly, element 5, ensuring benefit and reciprocity, is not the end point. This is something that needs to be contemplated, negotiated, and ensured throughout and after the research process. My book explains this in detail. However, in brief, this is the model. Element 1, adopt a child rights-based approach based on international law, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UNDRIP, Article 12 of the Convention, Article 19 of the UNDRIP, and implement appropriate research methodologies, in particular Laura Lundy's child rights-based approach, Martin Nakata's standpoint theory, Linda Tawani-Smith's decolonising methodologies, and Ray's convergence approach. Again, the book details that in more detail. So a child rights-based approach engages with children. It doesn't do research on children. Now, this aligns with Indigenous research methodologies and the decolonisation focus of those methodologies. The fusion in this model of a child rights-based approach with Indigenous methodologies rejects a welfare-based approach with its emphasis on provision and protection, of saving children, very much the premise of the intervention, saving children, and instead emphasises Indigenous young people's agency and capacity. Element 2 involves seeking ethical review, including governments seeking ethical review via agencies such as IATSIS. This is not just about researchers doing this. This is about consulting with Aboriginal communities well before engaging any young people in any participatory process. It's about mitigating cross-cultural research barriers to participation, such as addressing non-Indigenous status and conducting outsider research. It's about getting to know the community. It's about seeking appropriate permissions to talk with children and young people. This is vital. Element 3 involves undertaking preparatory activities with young people, including getting to know them before formally engaging them in participatory processes. This includes spending time with young people in their communities, in their settings, in their schools, in their youth clubs, and seeking from young people free, prior, and informed consent in child-friendly ways. Element 4 is what often people jump straight to without addressing elements or implementing elements 1, 2, and 3. This is about using child-friendly mechanisms to seek young people's views through play, by using technology such as iPads for photography, for video recording. It uses informal, non-intimidating discussion processes, such as the one I used, Dawn Bessarab's yarning method. It is also important, and this came out very strongly from my research, that any participatory process with Indigenous children done by non-Indigenous people, like myself, like government, must be conducted in the presence of trusted adults. This is vital. The 5th element, the participation process, must lead to benefits for young Aboriginal people and for their communities. And young people must be rewarded for their involvement. This is required and stipulated in the IATSIS Code of Ethics, and ways to undertake reciprocity are articulated in that excellent guidance document. Now, essentially, this model is about involving Indigenous young people in lawmaking processes and using international law and Indigenous research methodologies and child-friendly research methods for such consultations. So what does it look like? This is what it looked like for me. This is what implementing the model looked like in terms of using child-friendly tools like Magnatex or Lego, Play-Doh, and asking appropriate child-friendly questions such as, what's something that's important to you? Establishing a relationship with young people and using play-based tools to try and understand young people's worldviews. This is also what it looked like. It's about using the child's environment to understand and mitigate cross-cultural research barriers. You don't see a picture of a major hotel here. This is young people's environments. And it's important to go to young people, and that democracy must go to young people and not force young people to step outside their contexts in order to have a voice in civic life. And negotiating reciprocity arrangements is not something that should be done by the researcher or the decision maker. This is something that should be carried out in consultation with the young people involved in the participatory process. And young people like to use technology. They like to use youth-friendly methods to do this. This is a way to engage in reciprocity arrangements, to use tools that make young people feel as though they are having fun. And they are having fun in these processes, to not bore young people with seeking their views and lead to consultation fatigue. So these are some of the ways that young people engaged in my research. One young person here on the top left of the screen is undertaking a video recording of himself and doing that by himself. Another young person is taking a photograph of something that she has made as an example of something that is fun for young people to do. Now on to reciprocity arrangements. Young people in this research decided they wanted to have a party at the end of quite a long research process. We did provide, food and, things that young people could have, breaks with. That's really important too, to not engage young people in long processes of consultation without providing sustenance. So that's just bare minimum. But young people decided that they wanted to record their participation in this exercise by printing out all 400 of the the photographs that they took and mounting them onto cardboard and putting it around their classroom. What I can't stress enough is that it needs to be fun. When we engage with young people, we need to make it fun. We need to step away from this dynamic of powerful adult interviewing child. We need to break down that power dynamic, and as much as is possible, that is not fully possible. But I show you these photos because they're taken by young people during the research, and it demonstrates their experimentation with photography apps on iPads. But it also, I think, demonstrates the fun that the research engaged in, and I guess young people's freedom to make my head into a square, which I thought was hilarious. But also the rapport that it's possible to build rapport with young people if you spend the time to do that. Fly in, fly out consultations are not appropriate with young Indigenous peoples as outsider researchers or people seeking young people's views. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate the recommendation that came out of the first recommendation that came out of the Little Children Are Sacred report, which was the purported catalyst for the intervention. And this recommendation, number one recommendation, was that governments must genuinely consult with Aboriginal peoples. Now, this was not done prior to the intervention commencing, despite the fact that this report was the purported catalyst for the intervention, and this was recommendation one from it. Several young people involved in this study suggested lawmakers should just ask us, come and see us, before making laws that will affect them. And to do this, it is consistent with Australia's duties under international human rights law, particularly under Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Australia's obligations under Article 19 of the UN DRIP. It's also consistent with the principles associated with the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Imagination Declaration, and what both of those call for. This research shows a group of Aboriginal children and young people who are ready, who are willing, who are able to participate in the development of laws and policies that will affect their lives. I'd like to close with a statement by a 16-year-old young man that encapsulates the theme of this paper, who was involved in this research, when he said, "Ask us, this is our country." Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Holly. I really enjoyed that for all sorts of reasons, but it was a really fantastic overview about the value and importance of perspectives of young Aboriginal people, the importance of rewriting narratives, focusing on the valuing of Indigenous knowledge and young people's knowledge, and what happens when we don't. And particularly just so relevant this week as Parliament debates, and we've got a continuation of this punitive and ineffective and racist cashless card system. I could talk to you all day about that, but we have 2 questions and I'll just open them up. So if anyone else has questions, please pop them in the Q&A or the chat function. These questions, Holly, are from Meta Cousins, who asks, how do the opportunities for child participation compare with opportunities for participation for non-Aboriginal children in Australia? What are the implications of this framework for the participation of non-Aboriginal children in policy making, etc.? And this follows on, I suppose. How does this model of participation proposed cater for situations where communities are not necessarily in favour of children's participation, or when communities themselves lack opportunities for participation, which opportunities are nonetheless provided to the children?
Yeah, thank you, Meta, for your question. It's good to have you as a part of this webinar, and I acknowledge your contribution to children's participation in scholarship as well. And I'll start with the second portion of your question, Meta. I think that this research demonstrates the value of engaging Indigenous children in processes where their families were never asked to engage in a participatory process. Their communities were never asked. And it, I think, demonstrates the value of speaking to young people. It doesn't have to be sequential. It would be wonderful if it was. I think that it's not appropriate to speak with young Indigenous people as outsiders prior to engaging communities in those kinds of debates and inquiries. So I think that it's still of value to engage young people in these kinds of decision-making processes, but it absolutely challenges systems that don't engage Indigenous adults in this. And I've got to be honest, that came up in the research that I did, and in seeking consent from young people and their families, which I did both of. There were families that said, no, my child won't participate in this process because our community has not been asked to do this. And that was a very valid statement and concern. So I think that where adults haven't participated in consultations around law and policy, I don't think that precludes young people from participating. I think it highlights a gap, though. And to the issue to do with non-Indigenous children's participation, this model is of value to all children's participation. This model particularly takes into account cultural issues to do with outsiders like myself. Most legislators, most policy makers are outsiders to Indigenous communities because of the widespread exclusion of Aboriginal people from decision-making positions in this country. And so the majority of decisions that are going to be made about Indigenous policy are going to be made by non-Indigenous people. That is the value, I believe, of this model, is it provides a guideline for non-Indigenous people to undertake these consultations, and that those guidelines have been developed from the voices of young Indigenous peoples. I think that that is a really powerful element of this model. And it can be applied to all children's participation activities. And so It's just specifically focused on Indigenous children, but it's applicable across the board.
Thanks, Holly. I've got another question here. I don't know who it's from. It's saying anonymous. But this person says, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Holly. I can see how young voices would be vital for many areas of research like environmental science and policy. At the same time, it is very hard to get ethics approval for engaging children. Of course, first comes consultation and consent from elders, parents and carers. How can researchers balance the need to include children's voices with the obstacles and sometimes opposition to include children in research?
Yeah, I think this is a really big question. This research was done as part of the central case study of my PhD, and approximately 18 months of my 4-year candidature was absorbed in applying for ethics clearance. Now, a lot of academics find applying for ethics clearance bothersome and a roadblock that shouldn't be in place. What I learned during the process was ethics clearance is vital. If you think you've thought of everything, thought of all of the ethical problems that can arise, let me tell you, you're wrong. You won't have thought of all of the ethical problems that a committee of, up to 15 people generally can think of. That combination of, group of people from all different walks of life thinking about the ethical issues that can arise is so valuable. And I have to declare that as a result of this kind of deep learning about ethics and the engagement of young people in research, I have been a member of the Macquarie University Ethics Committee now for over 6 years. And I value that role and see the importance of doing that. I really am of the view that you should never, no governments should go and speak to young people, young Indigenous peoples, without having ethics clearance to do so. Because during that process, you learn so much about things that you haven't thought of. And you might even learn that you're not the right person to do the field research. I've kind of learned that if I had my chance again, I don't think that this project necessarily was a project that was within the scope of a PhD. That's why I'm working with Indigenous scholars now, and BioMe is a close collaborator of mine, and we're doing Indigenous-based research together because I have just learned more about the process of conducting outsider research and changed my view about that.
Thanks, Holly. Megan is asking, where adult community members gatekeep children's voices, isn't the sample and the voices heard skewed?
Yeah, and that is why in this model, and this is fleshed out more in the book, that one of the vital elements of a child rights-based approach to doing research or doing any kind of participatory activity is to make sure that the young people involved in doing that research have a really strong role in interpreting the findings. And child rights-based research demands that. So an individual researcher interpreting those findings all by themselves is not considered appropriate in the context of this kind of research. And to that end, I certainly could have done a better job in doing that. And we've built that into this new project around treaty in Victoria. And young people will be not only on our advisory committee, but the advisory committee and young people involved in the research will be assisting us in interpreting the research and drawing out key themes and coding the research. Not only that, but writing it up and co-presenting at conferences. So it's not just like oh, hi, give me all the data that I want. This is, and then see you later. It's an ongoing relationship with young people in communities, and hopefully being able to, I guess, engage in reciprocity in those communities, and facilitating young people's engagement in conferences or forums that might discuss that research that they contributed to.
Here's a comment from Talia, who thanks you for a fantastic presentation. Says, although the findings are horrifying, even when governments give Aboriginal children the chance to speak, such as in the Northern Territory Royal Commission, they still don't listen and act. And she goes on to say, she really enjoyed listening how First Nations people in the treaty process are valuing young voices, and this is a real guiding light for us. And I think that's just an incredible I guess, example, and it is a real guiding light to take us forward. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about where you are in the project at the moment, and what the timelines are?
Yes, sure. So we have funding to complete this project by the end of next year, and IATSIS is the main funder for this project, and we are working very closely with the Assembly on this project, because it's not appropriate not to, of course. And so we're talking with members of the Assembly, people who were voted to form the Assembly, and that includes young people who are members of the Assembly. And so we're hopefully speaking to a large number of people who voted and a large number of people who didn't vote in forming the membership of the Assembly. And we're hoping to ascertain and be able to document in academic journals, but also as well as through podcasts and child-friendly materials, the findings as a result of the research. So we'll be conducting field research for about another 3 months with young people in Victoria. And we're also talking to elders in Victoria and people who are not within the kind of, we're looking at about 13 to 28 as being classified as children and young people, around about that. We're not too strict on that. But we're also talking with more experienced members of the Assembly and the formation of that Assembly, and really interested in why did Aboriginal leaders decide to enfranchise young Aboriginal people. I mean, this is so cool. This is just the best, I think. I think it's the best thing that's happened in the landscape of Indigenous children's rights in as far as I can remember. I just think it's, I mean, as I said, this should be shouted from the rooftops. It's a huge advance that people in Scotland would love to know about, given they've enfranchised 16 and 17-year-olds. And there are other examples across the world of the enfranchisement of young people, but this is the first time in Australia. So I think that it's a really significant project, and one that when Baimi and I speak with people about it, they say, yes, we've got to record this in the academy, because there are no academic papers that will be recording this, and that would be a huge oversight if that was never recorded in the academy, let alone all of the other things we're hoping to achieve from it. So I hope I, in a long roundabout way, answered your question, Thalia.
Oh, thanks so much, Holly. Don't think we've got any more questions here, and we're almost out of time. But thank you so much for your time today. Absolutely critical issue of CRC and how it's playing out in the context of Australia with Indigenous children and young people. We will be rolling out our webinar series next year, and we would absolutely love to have you and Baimi back to be able to tell us a little bit more about as you progress, and through your work. It's absolutely fantastic work that you're doing with Baimi and the young people in Victoria, and we'd love to hear more about it. So thank you so much for your time today, Holly.
Thanks.
And
yeah.
And I'm going to just leave here now and shut this down. Thank you so much again, Holly.
Thank you, everybody.